It was a late autumn night, and I was driving home from a friend's wedding. The country road I chose was isolated, with nothing around but darkness. The only light came from my headlights cutting through the pitch-black night. The trees swayed in the wind, their leaves rustling, and occasionally a bird would dart across the road. I had been driving for over an hour, and the vast emptiness and silence made me feel drowsy. I opened the window, letting the cold air in to keep myself awake. Suddenly, in my rearview mirror, I noticed a pair of headlights following closely behind. It was an old truck with dim lights that barely illuminated the vehicle. I slowed down, hoping it would overtake me, but it stayed at the same speed, keeping a constant distance. I felt uneasy but tried to brush it off, thinking I was overreacting. I took a deep breath and continued driving, but the truck didn't leave. It stayed right behind me, its headlights glaring in my mirrors. I tried speeding up to lose it, but it sped up too. I turned onto a more remote side road, one that led into a dense forest. I figured that if the truck was just coincidentally behind me, it wouldn't follow down this barely known path. However, the truck's headlights remained in my rearview mirror, and it felt like they were staring directly into my eyes. I started feeling anxious, gripping the steering wheel tightly, my heart pounding louder in my chest. The car radio had gone silent. All I could hear was the sound of gravel crunching under my tires. I avoided looking into the rearview mirror, afraid of seeing those persistent headlights again. Then suddenly, the truck turned off its headlights. A wave of fear washed over me. I could no longer see where it was. My heart raced faster, sensing some unknown threat hidden in the darkness. I slowed down, listening intently to the sounds around me. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of wind rustling through the trees. Suddenly, out of the corner of my eye, I saw headlights appear on a side road. I quickly turned my head and realized that the truck had somehow reappeared on my right, silently emerging from the woods, attempting to block my path. I swerved and sped onto another, narrower dirt road. The road conditions grew worse, and my tires struggled in the mud, my heart feeling like it might burst out of my chest. I kept accelerating, desperately trying to lose the truck, but it maintained a constant distance behind me. Its headlights flickered on and off as if playing a sinister game of hide and seek. I felt trapped on this endless dark road. The tension in the car was suffocating. I considered stopping to call the police, but before I could decide, I heard a loud engine roar. The truck quickly approached from behind again. I slammed the gas pedal and the car shot forward. Ahead I saw an empty lot with an abandoned gas station. I decided to pull in, hoping to find a place to hide. I parked in the shadows of the gas station, turned off the engine, and shut off the lights, trying to calm myself down. The silence around me was thick. All I could hear was my own rapid breathing and the pounding of my heart. After a few moments, the truck slowly pulled up to the entrance of the gas station. Its headlights were still on, illuminating the entire empty lot. I stared at the truck, trying to make out the driver's face, but the inside of the vehicle was pitch black. The truck remained there, unmoving. No one got out, and no sound came from it. A cold chill ran down my spine, and sweat dripped down my back. Then, without warning, the truck's lights went out, plunging everything back into darkness. I held my breath, my heart racing in my chest. And that's when I heard it. A faint sound of footsteps approaching, getting closer and closer. I dared not move, feeling the presence nearing my car. Quickly, I locked the doors, my fingers trembling on the steering wheel, my mind racing with confusion. The footsteps stopped right beside the car. I could almost feel the person's breath against the window. I turned my head slightly and saw a hand press against the glass. In that instant, a flashlight beam pierced through the dark, and I saw a face, a stranger's face, pressed against the window with a twisted smile. I shut my eyes tight, my mind blank with terror. I don't know how long I stayed like that, but when I finally opened my eyes again, everything outside was quiet. The truck and the person were gone, leaving nothing but the howling wind across the empty lot. I forced myself to restart the car and sped away from that gas station. It wasn't until I got home that I realized my hands were still shaking. I told myself it must have been my imagination or just a lost driver, but deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Every time I recall that night, that sinister smile flashes in my mind, as if to remind me that whatever happened that night, it was far from over. I'm Tom, a software engineer working for a well-known tech company in Los Angeles. That night, I was working overtime on an important project. When I finally finished, it was already past 2:15 a.m. I was the only one left in the office, with the sound of my keyboard and the hum of computers eerily loud in the silence. I stretched, rubbed my sore eyes, and started packing up to head home. As I stood, I heard a strange noise from the hallway, like someone dragging something heavy. I peered out of the office door but saw nothing. Probably the cleaning staff, I reassured myself. Dragging my tired body, I walked to the elevator, ready to retrieve my car from the underground parking lot. The elevator descended slowly, each ding seeming to count down to something ominous. As the doors opened, an inexplicable chill ran through me. The usually bustling parking lot was unnaturally quiet, my footsteps echoing in the vast space, sending shivers down my spine. The dim lights cast bizarre shadows on the concrete walls, as if something could jump out at any moment. I quickened my pace towards my car, but as I passed a row of SUVs, I noticed an unfamiliar white van. It had no markings and its windows were completely blacked out. My instincts screamed that something was wrong, but I kept walking. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see a tall figure in a black hoodie approaching. His face was hidden in shadow, unrecognizable. I sped up and so did he. Fear consumed me and I started to run. In my panic, I took a wrong turn and found myself in an unfamiliar area. The maze of concrete pillars left me completely disoriented. The footsteps grew closer, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I hid behind a pillar, trying to catch my breath. Without warning, my phone rang. It was my girlfriend, Jenny. I quickly hung up, but it was too late. The footsteps headed in my direction, and I started running again. At a corner, I crashed into something, nearly falling. It was a cart piled with cleaning supplies. Thinking quickly, I grabbed a mop as a weapon and continued running. Just then, I spotted an emergency exit in the distance. I sprinted towards it with all my might, the footsteps behind me growing more urgent. Just as I was about to reach the door, a hand suddenly gripped my shoulder. I screamed in terror, instinctively swinging the mop. I heard a grunt and managed to break free from the grip, forcefully pushing open the emergency door and bursting out. The door led to an alley, and I ran without looking back until I reached a busy street. Shaking, I took out my phone and called the police. While waiting, I called Jenny back and told her what happened. She insisted on coming to me and arrived quickly. When the police came, we returned to the parking lot together. Unsettlingly, the suspicious white van was gone. The police checked the security footage, but bizarrely, it only showed me running alone in the parking lot. There was no sign of the van or anyone following me. This experience completely changed my work habits. I never stay late at the office anymore and always carry personal protection. The company increased security measures in the parking lot, but I still find myself recalling that terrifying night. To this day, I can't explain what really happened. Was I so exhausted that I hallucinated? Or was someone actually trying to harm me? Whenever I enter that parking lot, I involuntarily quicken my pace and look around warily. That night of terror is forever etched in my memory, a constant reminder to prioritize personal safety alongside career ambitions. I needed to get away from the city, away from the noise, the endless notifications, and the constant rush. So I decided to go camping, alone, in a secluded forest up in the mountains that I'd heard about from a few friends. They said it was beautiful, untouched, and, most importantly, quiet. The perfect place for a solitary retreat. By the time I arrived at the trailhead, the sun was already low in the sky. The forest was dense, filled with tall trees and thick undergrowth. The air was chilly, and as I set up my tent in a small clearing, the wind started to pick up, rustling the leaves above me. I built a small campfire, its crackling flames casting flickering shadows on the trees around me. It felt good to be alone, just me and the wilderness. I felt a sense of peace that had been missing for a long time. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature dropped sharply. I wrapped myself in my jacket, warming my hands by the fire, and listened to the sounds of the forest. A distant owl hooted, and occasionally a branch would snap somewhere in the distance. After a while, I decided it was time to call it a night. I doused the fire, zipped myself into the tent, and lay down on my sleeping bag, feeling the cold slowly seep in. I must have drifted off to sleep, but I woke up suddenly, not knowing how much time had passed. The forest was now completely dark, the kind of pitch black where you can't even see your own hand in front of your face. I lay there, trying to figure out what had woken me, when I heard it, a soft whisper. At first I thought it was the wind, but as I listened more closely, I realized it was definitely a voice. No, not just one, a few of them, speaking in hushed, hurried tones. They were close, too close, just beyond the thin fabric of my tent. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I strained to hear what they were saying, but I couldn't make out the words. It was like they were whispering just loudly enough for me to hear, but not enough for me to understand. I lay there, holding my breath, trying to convince myself that it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I reached for my flashlight and turned it on, shining it around the tent. Nothing seemed out of place, just the usual camping gear and the tent walls glowing softly in the light. I felt a bit foolish, thinking maybe I had imagined it. I turned off the flashlight and tried to go back to sleep, but the whispering started again. This time, it was louder, more urgent, and it seemed to be moving around the tent, like they were circling me. My heart raced. I sat up, listening carefully. The whispers were mixed with the sound of twigs snapping and leaves crunching underfoot, as if someone, or something, was walking around my campsite. I slowly unzipped the tent just a tiny bit, just enough to peek out. I could barely see anything through the dense fog that had rolled in, but I caught a glimpse of movement, a shadow darting between the trees. I quickly zipped the tent back up and tried to stay calm. My hands were shaking and my breath was coming in short, sharp gasps. I grabbed my phone to check for a signal, but there was nothing. No bars, no way to call for help. I cursed under my breath, trying to think of what to do next. The whispering continued, getting closer and closer, almost like it was right next to the tent now. I had to get out of there. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent again, ready to make a run for it. But as I did, the whispering suddenly stopped. The silence was deafening, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I held my breath, listening for any sound, but there was nothing, just the rustling of leaves in the wind. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw a small figure, barely visible through the fog, standing just a few meters away. It looked like a child, no more than 8 or 9 years old, just standing there, staring directly at me. My heart nearly stopped. What was a child doing out here in the middle of nowhere, in the dead of night? I called out, "Hey, are you okay?" But the figure didn't move, it just stood there, silently watching me. I shone my flashlight at it, but the beam seemed to fade in the fog, barely illuminating the figure. I tried again, "Do you need help?" Still, no response. The figure slowly turned and began to walk away, disappearing into the trees. I felt a strange mix of fear and concern. I couldn't just leave a child out here alone. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my flashlight and decided to follow. I stepped out of the tent, my feet crunching on the cold, damp ground. The fog was thick, and I could barely see a few feet ahead of me. I kept moving, following where I thought the child had gone, but it was hard to be sure. The forest was eerily quiet now. Even the wind had stopped. I kept calling out, hoping for a response, but only my own voice echoed back at me. After what felt like an eternity, I stopped. I had no idea where I was. The tent was far behind me, and I could see nothing but fog and trees in every direction. Panic began to set in. I turned around, trying to retrace my steps, but everything looked the same. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears, and my breaths came out in quick, shallow gasps. I was lost. Then, I heard it again. The whispering. This time, it was all around me, coming from every direction at once. I spun around, trying to see where it was coming from, but the fog was too thick. The voices grew louder, more insistent. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My flashlight flickered, and I tapped it desperately, trying to keep the light steady. Suddenly, a hand grabbed my shoulder. I screamed and whipped around, but there was no one there. just the fog swirling around me. My flashlight flickered out completely, leaving me in total darkness. I could hear my own breathing, rapid and shallow, mixing with the whispering that now seemed to be right in my ear. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, but I ran as fast as I could, crashing through the undergrowth, branches scratching my face and arms. The whispers seemed to follow me, chasing me deeper into the forest. I tripped and fell, mud and leaves sticking to my clothes, but I didn't stop. I kept running, panic fueling my every step. Finally, I saw a dim light through the trees, my campfire. I stumbled towards it, heart pounding, and collapsed next to the dying embers. I frantically looked around. The whispering had stopped. I was alone again, but the feeling of being watched remained. I never saw the child again. I stayed up the rest of the night, too afraid to close my eyes. At the first light of dawn, I packed up my things and left, not looking back once. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the isolation and the dark had played tricks on me. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that something was out there in the woods with me that night. Something that knew I was there and wanted me to know it too. I work the night shift at a 24-hour convenience store in the outskirts of town. It's usually quiet during my shift, sometimes too quiet. The store is located on a desolate stretch of road, and it's rare to see a customer after midnight. Tonight seemed like any other night. I was restocking shelves, and the radio behind the counter was playing a low, calming tune. The clock ticked past 3 a.m., and I had settled into the lull of routine. That's when the door chime rang. I turned around to see a man entering. He was tall, with a long, ragged coat that looked worn and dirty. He wore a black hat pulled low over his face, and I couldn't make out his features in the dim light of the store. He moved slowly, almost deliberately, as if he was weighing every step. I greeted him with a nod, but he didn't respond. Instead, he wandered through the aisles, glancing at items on the shelves. Something about him put me on edge. Maybe it was the way he seemed to be lingering, or the fact that he hadn't spoken a word. My instincts told me to stay alert. After what felt like an eternity, he approached the counter and placed a bottle of water down. I could feel his eyes on me, even though I couldn't see his face clearly. I scanned the bottle and told him the total, my voice wavering slightly. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a crumpled bill, handing it over slowly. His hand was cold to the touch, and a shiver ran down my spine. As I handed him his change, he finally spoke in a low, gravelly voice. "You shouldn't be here tonight." His words caught me off guard. I forced a smile and tried to play it off. "Well, it's my job. Can't leave just yet," I replied. But his eyes stayed fixed on me, and there was something unsettling in his stare. After a few seconds, he turned and walked out, his heavy boots echoing on the tiled floor. I felt a sense of relief as the door closed behind him, but that relief was short-lived. A few minutes later, the door chime rang again. I looked up, expecting another customer, but it was the same man. He stood in the doorway, staring straight at me. His hat was now tilted back slightly, and I could see his eyes, cold, dark, and unreadable. He didn't move, just stood there, watching. My heart started pounding, and I could feel the tension creeping up my neck. "Can I help you with something else?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer. He just stood there, his expression unchanged. After what felt like an eternity, he finally turned and walked out again. I watched him disappear into the shadows beyond the store's lights. I waited a moment, then quickly went to the door and locked it. Something was definitely not right. I returned to the counter, trying to calm myself. Maybe he was just drunk or confused. I glanced at the clock. It was almost 3:30 a.m. Just a few more hours, I told myself. I decided to keep myself busy by organizing the shelves behind the counter, my back to the entrance. That's when I heard it again, the chime of the door. I spun around, and there he was, standing inside the store again. This time, he was much closer, just a few feet away from the counter. His face was clearer now, illuminated by the fluorescent lights. His skin was pale, almost ghostly, and his eyes seemed darker than before. He didn't speak, just stared at me with that same expressionless look. "Look, buddy, I'm gonna have to ask you to leave," I said, trying to sound firm. My hand reached under the counter where we kept a baseball bat for safety. He didn't move, just kept staring. My heart was racing, and my fingers gripped the bat tightly. Then, without a word, he turned and slowly walked out of the store for the third time. This time, he didn't trigger the door chime. I watched him disappear again into the darkness, and I felt a cold sweat forming on my forehead. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there, just beyond the light, watching. I stayed behind the counter, clutching the bat, my eyes fixed on the door. The minutes dragged by, and I didn't see or hear anything. Just when I started to think it was over, I heard a faint tapping on the glass. My breath caught in my throat as I turned my head slowly toward the sound. There he was, standing right outside the glass door, his face pressed against it. His lips were moving, but no sound came out. He was mouthing something, over and over. I couldn't make out the words, but his eyes never left mine. I felt my body freeze. I didn't know what to do. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he stepped back, smiled at me with a grin that sent chills down my spine, and walked away into the night. I stood there, frozen, waiting, expecting him to come back, but he didn't. After a long, tense silence, I finally exhaled, realizing I had been holding my breath. I waited until morning, too scared to leave. When the day shift worker arrived, I told them what happened. They laughed, said I was overreacting, and maybe I was. But I can't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in that store. Not really. I haven't seen him since, but every night I dread hearing that chime again, wondering if he'll come back and what he wants if he does. A few weeks ago, I rented a small cabin deep in the mountains, hoping to get away from the stress of the city. The cabin was remote, nestled in a dense forest with tall old trees that seemed to stretch endlessly towards the sky. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the only sign of civilization was a narrow, winding road that led down to a small town at the base of the mountain. I was looking forward to the solitude, the peace and quiet. I needed this break. The first few days were exactly what I had hoped for. The crisp mountain air was refreshing, and I spent my days hiking and reading, enjoying the quiet isolation. At night, the cabin was dark and still, with only the sound of the wind whistling through the trees or the occasional rustle of an animal in the underbrush. I would sit by the fireplace, listening to the crackle of the burning wood, feeling the warmth seep into my bones. But on the third night, things began to change. That night, a storm had rolled in. The rain pounded against the cabin's roof, and the wind howled outside, making the windows rattle in their frames. I sat up in bed, listening to the storm, feeling a sense of unease that I couldn't quite place. I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me. After all, I wasn't used to being this far from everything. I tried to go back to sleep, pulling the covers tighter around me. Then, just as I was drifting off, I heard it. A faint knock at the front door. I froze, my heart suddenly racing. I lay there, listening, wondering if I had imagined it. Who could possibly be out here in this weather at this time of night? I waited, straining my ears. A minute passed, then two. Nothing. Just the sound of the rain and wind. I began to relax, thinking it must have been some debris blown against the door by the wind. Then I heard it again, louder this time, a distinct, deliberate knock. 3 knocks, spaced evenly apart. I sat up in bed, my pulse quickening. I glanced at the clock. It was just after midnight. My mind raced through the possibilities. Maybe it was a lost hiker, or someone whose car had broken down on the mountain road. But in this weather, at this hour, it didn't make sense. I grabbed a flashlight and quietly made my way to the front door. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I approached. I peered through the peephole, but all I could see was darkness. The porch light was out, and the rain was coming down so hard that it created a curtain of water just outside. I hesitated, then slowly reached out and unlocked the door, opening it just a crack. The cold wind rushed in, bringing with it a spray of rain. I called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" My voice was barely audible over the storm. I listened, but there was no response, no movement, no sound other than the howling wind and the rain pounding the earth. I shivered, half from the cold and half from something else, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I quickly shut the door and locked it again, deciding it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I turned off the flashlight and made my way back to bed, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled in my stomach. But just as I lay down, I heard it again. The same 3 knocks, slow and deliberate, coming from the back door this time. I shot up in bed, my heart thudding in my chest. How could that be? I hadn't seen or heard anyone walk around the cabin. I grabbed the flashlight again and crept to the back door, moving slowly, trying to be as quiet as possible. My hands were shaking as I reached the door, and I peered through the small window. There, through the rain and darkness, I saw a faint figure standing a few feet away from the door. It was hard to make out any details in the dark, but it looked like a child, a small figure, hunched over, shivering in the cold. My first instinct was concern. What was a child doing out here in the middle of a storm? I hesitated, my hand hovering over the door handle. I called out again, "Hey, are you okay? Do you need help?" The figure didn't move, didn't respond. It just stood there, facing the door. I felt a chill run down my spine, the hairs on my arms standing up. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe they were scared or in shock. I decided to open the door, just a bit. I slowly turned the handle and opened it a crack. The figure didn't move. I called out again, louder this time. "Hey, do you need help?" Still, no response. Just as I was about to open the door wider, a flash of lightning illuminated the entire backyard, and I saw the figure clearly for the first time. It was not a child. The figure was small and hunched, but its proportions were all wrong. Its arms were too long, its head too big, and its face, it had no face. Just a smooth, featureless surface where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been. I slammed the door shut, my hands trembling, and locked it. I stumbled back, breathing heavily, my mind racing. What had I just seen? Was it real, or was my mind playing tricks on me? I backed away from the door, never taking my eyes off it, half expecting the thing to start knocking again. But everything was silent. The only sound was the rain and the wind outside. I backed up all the way to the living room and grabbed my phone, frantically trying to dial 911. No signal. Of course, there wouldn't be, not out here in the middle of nowhere. I cursed under my breath, looking around for something, anything to defend myself with. Then I heard it again. Not knocking this time, but a scraping sound like something being dragged across the wooden porch. Slowly, methodically. My breath caught in my throat. I crept back to the front door, my heart pounding in my ears, and peered through the peephole. The porch was empty, but the scraping continued, moving around the side of the cabin, heading toward the back door. I felt a surge of panic. I ran to the back door and pushed a heavy chair against it, trying to block it. The scraping sound stopped, and everything went quiet again. I stood there, clutching the chair, waiting, listening. Then, just as suddenly, the knocking started again, this time on the window right next to me. I jumped back, stifling a scream, and turned to look. The face was there again, pressed against the glass, smooth and featureless. It was still staring at me, even without eyes. I stumbled backward, knocking over a table, and then, in a flash of lightning, it was gone. I don't know how long I stood there, waiting, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps, but it never came back. When the dawn finally broke, I grabbed my things and left the cabin without looking back, driving as fast as I could down the mountain road. I never told anyone about what happened that night. Who would believe me? Even now, I can't shake the image of that faceless figure out of my mind. And I know, deep down, that whatever it wasn't human. That's today's story. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe to my channel, and turn on the notification bell. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.